The main goal of this lab was to determine the frequency response function of a system with infinite degrees of freedom. The main materials used in the lab were a flexible beam with a strain gauge attached to it, a Quanser servo motor plant, a terminal board and amplifier, and the Quark Simulink computer program. The image to the right shows how all these materials were connected in order to perform the lab. The lab was broken down into two main parts. The first part consists of 6 tests in which we define frequencies and amplitudes for the servo motor. The second part of the lab consisted of 5 tests in which random frequencies were constantly sent to the servo motor.
The lab commenced with calibration of the strain gauge attached to the flexible beam. We then measured the sinusoidal forced frequency response of the flexible beam, and thirdly, we measured the random variable forced frequency response of the flexible beam. All measurements were coordinated using a Quark MATLAB Simulink program that sends signals to an amplifier via Quanser DAQ board. The amplifier was responsible for providing power to the rotary motor that caused the flexible beam to wobble, hence registering deflections of the strain gauge.
The first part of the lab involves setting the beam at certain frequencies and collecting data using the Simulink software. The data being collected was the motor angle of the beam deflection over a certain period of time. Results can be seen on the figure to the left, where the motor angle is a much larger amplitude than beam deflection for the frequency equal to 1 Hz. The way of analyzing this frequency response involves visually interpreting the maximum and minimum values of the sinusoidal curve and determining the amplitudes from there. The amplitude ratios were then determined by dividing the two amplitudes of the motor angle and beam deflection. In order to calculate the phase angle, the time crossings are determined visually, averaged together, and then plugged into the equations shown on the slide. These ratios and angles are shown here in Table 1 with little correlation between the tests at different frequencies. This method of frequency response is not as accurate due to visually interpreting data points and is very time-consuming. As well, the response can only be calculated when the frequency remains constant, which limits when this method is used. The second part of this lab involves sending the beam out to go through a wide range of frequencies in a single run where the motor angle and beam deflection data is collected. The way of analyzing this frequency response involves the FFT, fast Fourier transform, which is a sample code provider that takes the data as an input and uses MATLAB functions and commands to determine the response. The method of FFT is more precise since there are built-in MATLAB functions that can calculate frequency response without doing calculations by hand and visually interpreting data like in Part 1. The big disadvantage of this is that only can be used when the frequencies vary. If they remain constant, this method will not work. The graph to the left shows a random vibration in the beam deflection plotted versus the motor angle. In the middle figure, the results from Part 1 are plotted against the FFT method of random vibrations. Inaccuracies are shown in the results from Part 1, the red dots, not followed exactly with the black dots, the FFT results. For the figure to the right, a transfer function was found in the FFT results by determining the gains, zetas, and omegas that make up the transfer function. The transfer function fits very well, indicating how the method can be done with very less error.